There's been a big hoopla, both on the news and social media, regarding the recent spat of neo-Nazis and right-wingers being pelted with milkshakes and eggs and such. Surprisingly, a lot of leftists have been overjoyed by it, including Jake from the Bible Reloaded. I find it odd, considering I've always figured that sort of immature outburst wouldn't be amusing to proponents of civility, but sadly I've come to find that most people are only down with civility so long as it benefits them or their alleged team. So I posted this little quip. Her, they threw a milkshake at the bad man. That's good. Yes, I'm sure you're a very mature adult. Somewhere down the line, Jake posted his opinion about how he finds it funny and not problematic in the slightest. Now, I can see how one might laugh in the moment as a result of immature schadenfreude, but all it takes is 2 seconds of contemplation to see how it's not really funny. In the same way you might laugh at seeing an old lady fall down the stairs until you realize the real-world implications. I'm pretty sure people who think it's appropriate have never had anything thrown or dumped on them, and if you walked up and spit on them, they'd suddenly get why it's wrong. And Jake here has tried to use the fact that people used to throw tomatoes and other food items in the past as a justification for doing it now. Never thought I'd see the day where leftists were quick to use an argument of traditionalism to defend a shitty behavior. I always considered that part of the right-wing wheelhouse. Maybe acting like medieval morons isn't the standard we should have in the 21st century. It's also extremely short-sighted to think that this isn't going to escalate beyond foodstuffs, and a lot of people tried to call him on it, to no avail of course. Jim the Ape says, I'm not upset about it, but I do understand why some people are. Make fun of it all you want, but it is technically a physical assault with a foreign object. It may be very low severity, but it is on the spectrum of violence. I just find the hypocrisy of people like you funny. To which Jake replies, Not a hypocrite in any way. I've had the same take on desserts forever. Find where I've been outraged by dessert tossing. So instead of addressing the fact that it is a low-stakes act of violence, which is something he has not been a proponent of in any other instance before, he pivots to whether or not he has a problem with dessert throwing specifically. The hypocrisy is Jake's sudden complacency with a physical assault, so long as he deems both the weapon and the victim acceptable. So to try and drive the short-sighted nature of his position home, I posted, So you'd be okay if I started a campaign to get people to throw food at you because of your political leanings? Let's see how committed you are to this position in real life. Jake responded, If you start a campaign to throw things at me, you'd be on the hook for incitement. If some randos threw milkshakes at me because they don't like that I argue for human rights, equality, and moral actions, then that's a different and probably funny story. Listen to this guy's humble brag implications. They don't like that I argue for human rights, equality, and moral actions, so it would be absurd for anyone to want to throw a milkshake at me for my great humanitarian opinions. Sure, bud. If he thinks it's okay to throw food at people to publicly humiliate them, intimidate them into silence, and stain the clothing they paid for, which is destruction of personal property, then he clearly doesn't care about moral actions or human rights. His opinion is completely dependent on whether or not he finds you morally worthy of rights. And although I agree getting milkshaked isn't the end of the world, it is still technically assault and battery, which is a crime, which means that Jake is also a proponent of Vigilantism, which is an all-around un-American subversion of the rule of law. So my retort was, on the hook for incitement? Incitement to a thing you yourself think is a non-issue and would be funny? So why would I be worried? You just laugh it off, right? I think it's pretty obvious that he, nor any sane human being, wouldn't find it funny at all if they actually put any thought into it. All he cares about is attacking the enemy, but he doesn't seem to understand that everyone, including the neo-Nazis, think that their position is as virtuous and righteous as his. So if leftists feel justified in attacking people over opinions, then the far right is going to feel justified in doing the same. You're setting a very dangerous precedent. It doesn't matter who has the correct opinion. This isn't an argument of moral equivalence. This is about the consistency of vigilantism being ethically wrong. And I can hear these hypocrites now. That's not fair though. Nazis are bad and I'm good. Nazis deserve to get milkshaked and I don't. Yes, Nazis are bad, but the universe doesn't care who is right or wrong. Initiating violence begets violence, and you might end up on the losing end no matter how morally correct you thought you were. So it seems to me in everyone's best interest not to initiate violence. If someone does, call the fucking cops. Quite frankly, I don't think these kids have the discernment skills necessary to determine who is or is not an actual Nazi. Because they've moved on to milkshaking politicians for being too right-wing, and YouTubers for making rape jokes in bad taste. This is the slippery slope in action. They started with neo-Nazis because they know they can get away with it. Neo-Nazis are the least sympathetic demographic in America next to pedophiles, so these kids can use them as a punching bag and take out their aggression and nobody's going to call them on it. It's basically a free pass to be a violent thug towards someone. But now they've expanded their targets to basically include anyone with an opinion they find unsavory. The use of force to silence an opinion, even as mild as throwing a milkshake, is authoritarian. But nobody granted you that authority, so you stand in juxtaposition to the rule of law. Some Twitter rando jumps in and says, "If only the skeptosphere were as concerned about Nazi murderers." Well, I don't speak for the entire skeptosphere, but the fact that Nazi murderers exist is so self-evidently a problem, I can see why people don't make a lot of videos about it. The skepto-fucking-sphere seemingly revolves around hot takes, so nobody's gonna watch a video about how Nazis are bad because we all already fucking know that. Am I also supposed to make videos about how water is wet and fire is hot? That being said, I and many of my peers have made videos against white supremacy and nationalism, and those are the ideological heart of neo-Nazism. So this kid's accusation is a baseless stereotype. On top of that, not a single person who has been milkshaked thus far is a murderer as far as I know. So I replied, "Who did Sargon murder, you exaggerator?" Another sycophant joins in and says, "Even if it did bother you, you'd be able to choose to press charges. Actions, speech is an action, have consequences. You promote shitty ideals and make bad rape jokes. Maybe someone throws a milkshake at you. Maybe that person gets fined or goes to jail for assault." Wow, where to start? Sure, I guess if you want to be semantic, speaking is an action, but ostensibly we all understand that there's a line between words and physical actions. Also, the consequence for words should be more words. If someone says something stupid, you call them fucking stupid. You don't get to hit them. The punishment does not fit the crime in that case. That if someone says something stupid, that shouldn't be considered a crime either. Same goes with throwing a milkshake at someone for a bad joke. That's so childishly irresponsible and beyond the pale of what a reasonable reaction should be. And what kind of logic is that? Maybe that person gets fined or goes to jail for assault. By that logic, it's okay to murder and rape people as long as you're okay with doing the jail time. And that same logic was used to justify murdering Gandhi. That's why vigilantism is wrong. The general public doesn't have the cognitive skill necessary to make unilateral decisions about justice. Psych goes on to say, "Fuck these calls for civility against groups of people who see women or people of color as lesser beings, or ones that think rape is funny. You do not get to be treated civilly for being a shitty person. That's not the social contract I signed." Ironically, by Psych's own logic, I can act uncivil towards shitty people, and I think Psych's position is shitty. Therefore, I would be totally justified in being uncivil and dumping a milkshake on him. Because it's all up to my subjective opinion, and if I think you deserve civility, apparently. I replied, "I didn't sign a social contract at all, but if I did, it would involve vigilantism over words." And yes, I have to admit it is a very low-stakes violence, but it exists on a spectrum. Getting flicked in the ear is better than getting punched. Getting punched is better than getting stabbed. The fact I didn't stab you doesn't justify me flicking you in the ear. You don't get to justify moving beyond the line of words to violence just because you found someone else's words abhorrent. In principle, that makes you no better than the drunk at the bar who beats people up when he feels insulted, or the guy who shoots up a building over a drawing of Muhammad. You're not a fucking hero, you're just unable to control your outrage. I can see the argument that their words lead to extremism, but you can't stop that with the use of force. This all reminds me of another argument I had recently about former Proud Boy turned Nazi goofball Joe Vival getting egged in New York, and the pro-vigilante attitudes that surrounded the event.
I think like, hey,
Do you feel threatened?
covering your face.
Maybe you should go cover our faces and you might fuck up.
No, I just don't want anybody trying to. The guy threw coffee at.
Oh shit! Ew!
Yes.
Oh my god!
Again, he might deserve that shit on an ethical level, but it's still wrong to do, and nobody has the authority to do it. Two wrongs don't make a right, although two negatives do make a positive, so I'm not sure what to make of that. People on Twitter were celebrating and supporting the egging, and some guy named Bruce chimed in to rain on the parade by saying, "Y'all endorsing violence?" Some dude pops in and says, "Against Nazis? Yes." It's so hard to take it seriously as violence, but by definition it is. Either way, it's immature and counterproductive and has the potential to escalate out of hand. So I replied, "So by that standard, violence against anyone with a lousy opinion is also acceptable? How about communists who want to exterminate the haute bourgeoisie? Which words and thoughts are we allowed to enact violence upon?" He responded, Let's talk about communism again when it's a problem in Western societies again, like Nazis are today. Nazis are ever less a problem with every passing year. Their numbers are steadily dwindling. You can point to the fact that the majority of terrorism in America is white nationalist, but terrorism itself is a fringe crime statistic. That being said, egging neo-Nazis isn't stopping the ideology. Like really, you think if somebody walked up and egged Hitler during World War II, he'd just be like, Ach, ich bin hit in the head mit einer Eggenheimer. The yoke is on meine face. I have reconsidered my position on the Jewish problem. The Third Reich is over. Of course not. Nobody anywhere has stopped being a Nazi because you threw food on them. If anything, it causes them to insulate themselves and to escalate retaliations. All you managed to do is deplatform them for a short period of time, but in doing so have created a Streisand effect that draws more people to hear the opinion you tried to silence. Yet another random jumps in and says, Nazism doesn't have a place in peaceful public discourse. It's an ideology that promotes violence against people who don't fit their ubermensch eugenics criteria. To say, just reason with them, suggests there's something reasonable to their ideas to begin with. I replied, the purpose of reasoning with people is to convince them of the validity of your point. The validity of theirs is irrelevant. If someone has legitimately called for violence, that's a crime and you should call the police. Well, ideally, in a perfect world, Nazism wouldn't exist at all. But it does, and trying to deplatform it from public discourse is both foolhardy and impossible. It's impossible because bad ideas will always exist and push their way to the front. You would have to erode civil liberties pretty hard in order to prevent discussion about it. And it's foolhardy because light is the best disinfectant. You need these bad ideas in public discourse so they can be publicly flogged and ridiculed. So long as the majority opinion is that Nazism is stupid, it has nowhere to spread. But to do that, you need to hear and confront all their ideas in the public sphere. Gertie replied, There's a point to be made that in Nazi Germany, the existence of Jews was made illegal. It's not always a given that police are good actors. Anyway, without the vigilante antics of the French resistance, Nazis would have gotten their supply trains and the invasion of Normandy would have gone differently. Maybe poorly, in fact. Sure, some cops are bad, but so are most vigilantes. And I don't get why every time these people get in a debate about neo-Nazis in America, they start talking about events of World War II. Sure, if the neo-Nazis take over the government and burn down the White House and blame it on the Jews and then start executing people en masse, then you have all the justification to harm the ones responsible. But as of right now, we're talking about a fat guy waving a flag and saying dumb shit. This isn't Nazi Germany, it's America, and we're still under the rule of law, and hopefully we can still trust some of the police to do their job. Sure, as I've pointed out before, neo-Nazis as a group do cause harm, but it's unethical and unconstitutional to punish people for crimes by proxy. So if you know Joe Vival murdered a guy, then by all means call the cops. But you can't throw an egg at him because some other neo-Nazis killed a guy in Alabama. That's not how justice works. So I said, a resistance force in an occupied country during war isn't the same as vigilantism. Dude came back and replied, Please explain the difference to the Taliban. Perhaps if I had some line of communication to the Taliban, I would. But that only furthers my point, that people tend to paint themselves and their own cause as righteous, which leads to justifying violence. Force should only be used against force, not against speech. Dude retorts, So if I say person X should be killed, you think that that is okay and should not be responded with police force because it's free speech? In my world, that is incitement of violence, and that gets you to prison. Coincidentally, in the USA too. Yes, it is. But that's not what we're talking about. You're moving the goalposts. Of course a direct threat on a person's life is a crime. I didn't hear that tubby neo-Nazi threaten anybody. If he did, again, we'd call the police. We don't personally assault them unless they attack someone. I don't get why this is so complicated for these people. If the person hasn't committed a crime, you can't punish them. And they start ascribing to people crimes that they didn't commit, just because said crime exists somewhere in America. Nobody is born a neo-Nazi, so if people can be talked into it, they can be talked out of it. You can't egg a man out of an ideology. You can't censor it either. Germany tried. Drives it to the underground echo chambers where it grows like mold. Beat the idea by showing how stupid it is. The only thing that will effectively put an end to white supremacy is education and integration. If neo-Nazis keep having their ideas challenged and so thoroughly debunked, they eventually start to question their own ideology. And the more they have to interact with minorities, the more opportunities they get to realize they're fucking wrong. Most neo-Nazis come from very insulated intra-racial communities, and they don't know anything about minorities other than stereotypes, so exposure makes them confront their ignorance. A good example is Daryl Davis, a black man who befriended KKK members and convinced them to leave the group. He did it simply by chatting with them individually about things they had in common, and they realized how wrong their perceptions were. If Daryl Davis just ran up and threw pies in their faces like the Three Stooges, there'd probably be more Klansmen the next day. So as far as I can tell, we have to engage in dialogue with these scumbags because it's the only way that works. Throwing stuff is just an expression of your impotent rage, and is likely to escalate into real-world violence. Stop being a fucking child and work on your reasoning skills. You should be able to out-debate a Nazi.